One biome review was so much fun. You're jumping right into chapter 2, biogeochemical cycles. So before I talk about what you have to know at the end of this, I wanted to introduce you to the big six, which are the 6 elements that are found in all organisms. So all organisms contain these 6 major elements. Of these 6 elements, 3 of their cycles are really important for environmental science, and you will be tested on them on the AP exam. So the big 6, when I learned it, when I took AP environmental science, well, that was 15 years ago, I called them CHOPNess. Lovely acronym. So it's carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. Some teachers do teach the sulfur cycle. I didn't this year. Sorry, dudes. Not needed, but super fun. We can talk about it later if you want. So carbon, along with hydrogen, form all organic molecules. All organic molecules are made of carbon and hydrogen. So these are our carbohydrates, so sugars, our lipids, these are our fats, and also all of our cell membranes. Nucleic acids, DNA and RNA are genetic material, and proteins. These are our enzymes, all of the things in our cells that make us go. So carbon, really important. We're going to talk about carbon. Nitrogen, found in nucleic acids and proteins. We're not going to talk about the oxygen cycle. Phosphorus, found in lipids and nucleic acids. And then sulfur, a really cool cycle that we're not going to talk about. So for each cycle, what do you have to know? So for those that were highlighted for carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, you have to know its importance for sustaining life. We already touched on that a little bit. I'm going to dive a little deeper coming up. We need to know its main sources and sinks and the human impacts to each cycle. I did not include the water cycle in this because I have a little tab on it in OneNote and I thought you could review it on your own. So the carbon cycle, why it's important. It's important because it is the backbone of all organic life. That's it. And there's the introduction to the cycle. So how carbon moves, carbon dioxide is found in the atmosphere and the ocean, and it is converted to glucose through photosynthesis by our autotrophs, by our plants and algae. So we can see that happening. So it diffuses maybe from the atmosphere into the ocean, and then carbon dioxide is converted into glucose in the ocean by photosynthesizers, and also on land by plant producers. Glucose is then converted into molecules by synthesis in living things, so animals can use glucose and do things with it. Organic carbon is converted to fossil fuels by pressure and heat over millions of years. It's stored as fossil fuels, and its largest reservoir is as sedimentary rock, as limestone, which makes the base for Florida, so pretty important for us. And the second largest reservoir is as dissolved carbon dioxide in the ocean. Other things, glucose in animals is broken down in cellular respiration and returned as carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. That's respiration. And then deforestation, plants store carbon in their plant bodies, and when we cut down the forest and we burn the forest, we release that carbon back into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. Big impacts are removal of vegetation. This reduces photosynthesis and increases atmospheric carbon dioxide. So whenever we remove those primary those primary producers, our autotrophs, our photosynthesizers, we're reducing the amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide that we are taking, and we are increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide. When we burn our fossil fuels that have been stored for millions of years by pressure, we're releasing that stored carbon, which increases atmospheric carbon dioxide. And whenever we increase atmospheric carbon dioxide, we are increasing the greenhouse effect. So there are certain greenhouse gases that we're going to talk about later. And when they're in the atmosphere, they trap heat on the earth. Some of that is good, because without the greenhouse effect, it would be really, really cold. But whenever you have too much of them, or they accumulate too quickly, it just increases temperature too much. We'll talk about that later more. Next up is the nitrogen cycle. It's important because we need it to make nucleic acids. We need it to make proteins. That's the big things that they're found in. So if you want to reproduce your cells, if you get a cut and you need to have more cells being made, you need to replicate all your DNA. So nucleic acids are super important there, and proteins for all of life. Atmospheric nitrogen, N2, that's how most of nitrogen is stored in the atmosphere, has a triple bond. So you have two nitrogens that are bound together by a triple covalent bond, and that triple covalent bond is really hard to break. A single covalent bond is hard to break. A double covalent bond is even harder to break. A triple covalent bond, atmospheric nitrogen does not want to be broken down. So the big part of this cycle is breaking that triple bond. And how we do it is through fixation. So there are certain bacteria, a lot of them live in the roots of legumes like beans, and they're able to take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it into NH3, which that's ammonia, which is more easily able to be absorbed by plants. So plants can't use N2 because of those triple bonds, but it can use NH3, it can use ammonia. So we have these bacteria that are able to take atmospheric nitrogen, take that N2, break those triple bonds, and then release it as ammonia, as NH3, and then plants are able to use it. Voila, it's amazing. But that process takes a long time, and humans, not known for our patience. So Haber did a lot of really cool things for chemistry, but the Haber process, which is named after him, basically does this mechanically, takes atmospheric nitrogen and converts it to ammonia. And this is how we make fertilizer. So we have a biological way to do fixation, and we also have an anthropogenic way to do nitrogen fixation. Water reacts with ammonia to form an ammonium ion, ammonium. So you have ammonia released by fixation, and then it reacts with water to form ammonium, NH4+. Nitrification is when you convert that ammonium into NO2 and then into NO3, which is how plants really, really, really want it. They really want it as nitrates. So we have atmospheric nitrogen, N2, triple bound. Plants can't use it. They're like, we need nitrogen to make nucleic acids, we need nitrogen to make proteins, but we can't get it. We can't break down that triple bond. So bacteria break it down for them and make ammonia, or fertilizer is applied to them as ammonia, and then water mixes with that ammonia, making ammonium, and then ammonium goes through nitrification and turns into a nitrate, NO2 minus or NO3 minus. Assimilation is when ammonium or an ammonium ion, or when those nitrates are absorbed by plants or absorbed by any organism that needs it. And ammonification is any reaction that yields ammonia or an ammonium ion. So technically, fixation is an ammonification reaction. And when a plant takes that up, it's called assimilation. Denitrification is returning that nitrate back to atmospheric nitrogen. So whenever you convert that nitrate ion back to that atmospheric nitrogen gas triple bonded together, that's denitrification. You've taken nitrogen out of the atmosphere in fixation, and then you are returning it in denitrification, and that's done by lightning and bacteria. Human impacts. The big one is fertilizer, which we talked about already, and the burning of fossil fuels. So when we combine our N2 gas with oxygen, we get nitric oxide, and we do that from burning fossil fuels or by cutting down forests. Once we're started on that, we have that nitric oxide. We've started on this cycle. That nitric oxide will will react with more oxygen in the atmosphere to make nitrogen dioxide gas. And when nitrogen dioxide gas interacts with water, we get nitric acid. And nitric acid is what forms acid deposition, acid rain. So when we burn fossil fuels, we make nitric oxide. And when nitric oxide reacts with the air, we get nitrogen dioxide gas. And when nitrogen dioxide gas reacts with water, we get nitric acid. And so once we've started burning fossil fuels, once we start making nitric acid, there's no way to stop this. Well, there are ways, we'll talk about them later, but in how I've presented it to you, acid rain is the result. Nitrous oxide, N2O, is released from fertilizer and waste decomposition, and we also, which is ends up being added into the water, and then runoff from fertilizer, farm waste, sewage, all of that additional nitrogen ends up in the ecosystem, and nitrogen's a limiting factor. Algae and plants all need nitrogen to grow, need nitrogen to make their nucleic acids and their proteins. That whenever you increase nitrogen, you increase the amount of organisms that can be supported. So that sounds good. You're like, oh, but increased photosynthesizers, hooray, Earth. What ends up happening is you simulate algae. And then the algae uses up the nitrogen and then dies. And then aerobic decomposers break down that dying algae and it sucks all the oxygen out of the water. Not so good. The phosphorus cycle is important. I said it's because it's seen in proteins. Also, it makes all of your cell membranes have a phosphate head on them. I don't remember that term, phospholipid membrane, but that's a phosphate group right on the top of your cell membrane, keeping what needs to be in and what needs to be out, and acting as your first, I got 2 AP Bio on you, I'll stop. It's a membrane. And then also phosphate groups are used in ATP. ATP is adenotriphosphate. It's an adenosine with 3 phosphate groups, and when that phosphate group is popped off, it releases energy. So phosphate groups are how it's cell energy. It's how cells work. This cycle is entirely sedimentary. So when we looked at the nitrogen cycle and when we looked at the carbon cycle, there were atmospheric components and also surface ground components and oceanic components. This is mostly in the soil. It's sedimentary. So phosphate is stored on land and in ocean sediment, and it's released by weathering, by erosion, into the ocean. Animals get phosphorus by eating plants or animals that have absorbed it from the soil or from the water. Decomposition is what changes organic molecules with phosphorus back into phosphate. But really it's erosion. You also get some leaching and runoff from fertilizers here too. We'll talk about that in a second. Phosphates were used in fertilizers and soaps. Phosphates are no longer used in soaps, so we're starting to stop seeing so much mining of phosphates for that. But we still have phosphates that are used in fertilizers. It's another limiting nutrient. And mining disrupts ecosystems. We have a whole unit on mining coming up. Get excited. And we remove phosphorus from ecosystems by cutting down forests. So you end up seeing a lot of issues there as well. And whenever you add phosphate as a fertilizer, we have that same dead zone that we talked about before with nitrogen. And that is it.